She still saw it in her sleep. Nia's feet, bare, defiant, moving like the floor belonged to her. That conference room. That song. That smile when she won. Kim Soo had replayed it 419 times in a 6x8 cell, counting the cracks in the ceiling and sharpening the memory until it cut. The prison gates opened on a Tuesday. No fanfare. Just cold air and a blacked-out SUV idling at the curb, its engine too quiet for something that dangerous. Halfway across the Pacific, Nia threw her head back laughing as a wave took her under. Dan pulled her up by the waist, and she kissed him with salt on her lips. Bora Bora, the Maldives, Jeju. They moved through honeymoon light like the world had no edges. Kim Soo ran until her lungs tore. She lifted until her shoulders split. She memorized compound layouts and choke points, and the exact distance between a heartbeat and silence. They had stolen everything from her. Her man, her pride, her 2 years. She would collect with interest. And this time, she wasn't coming alone. If you haven't watched part 1 yet, go do so now before coming back here. You are going to be mind blown. Every great story deserves a great audience, and you've proven you're exactly that. Now make it official. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, and join a community that shows up for every release and every video. Even the stories the algorithm wasn't brave enough to recommend. We found each other anyway. Subscribe now, and make sure we find you next time, too.
This next video will blow your mind, so sit back, grab a popcorn, and switch on the AC because we are turning the heat up.
The envelope arrived on the 1st of every month, without fail, like a bill she hadn't asked for and couldn't stop receiving. Nia had a system. She'd pour her morning coffee. 2 sugars, no cream. Carry it to her home office on the 4th floor of Dan's estate, and open the manila envelope before the day had a chance to soften her. Inside would be a single sheet of paper, folded in thirds, printed in clean 12-point font, as though professional formatting could disguise the madness underneath. You looked tired at the charity gala. The blue dress didn't help. I watched Dan park his car on Wednesday. He still drives himself sometimes. Brave. Enjoy the vacation photos. I have better ones. Nia would read it once. Photograph it. Log it in the spreadsheet. Column A for date. Column B for threat classification. Column C for any actionable intelligence. Then she'd slide it into the archival binder, the 4th one this year, and go back to her coffee. Dan had stopped asking to see them months ago. She'd shown him the first few and watched something cold move through his eyes. The syndicate boss in him surfacing, calculating, and she decided she preferred handling it herself. He had enough wars. By October, the binder was 2 inches thick. By October, the wedding was 6 weeks away. The florist confirmed gardenias and white orchids on a Wednesday. The caterer sent the final tasting menu on Thursday. On Friday, Nia sat in a glass-walled conference room negotiating a commercial property deal that would triple her firm's footprint in the Han River district. And she did it with the calm efficiency of a woman who had decided that Kim Soo did not get to live rent-free in the hours that mattered. She was good at that, the compartmentalizing. Her therapist called it a gift. Dan called it terrifying. But that evening, sitting cross-legged on the kitchen counter while Dan cooked, she watched him move between the stove and the cutting board and felt the particular kind of peace that arrives not when problems disappear, but when you've decided they won't win. He caught her looking and raised an eyebrow. "You're doing the thing," he said. "What thing?" "The thing where you look at me like you're memorizing me." She smiled into her wine glass. "Maybe I am." He set down the knife and crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and kissed her temple, her cheek, the corner of her mouth, slow, deliberate, like punctuation. Like a man who understood what was worth protecting. She didn't tell him about the newest letter. The one that hadn't come in an envelope this time, but had been left under the wiper blade of her car in the firm's underground parking garage, which meant someone with access had put it there. 6 weeks, Nia. I've gotten very patient. She'd photographed it. Logged it. Column C, security breach, parking level B2, review access logs. Then she'd driven home and let Dan cook for her and decided that fear was a thing she would process on her own schedule. What she didn't know, what no spreadsheet column could have captured, was that 3 miles across the city, in a glass tower with no name on the building directory, a man in a charcoal suit was sliding a photograph of her across a lacquered table. The photograph showed Nia outside the florist, laughing at her phone. Kim Soo, seated across from him, didn't touch it. She didn't need to. She'd already memorized every version of Nia's face. 6 weeks, the man said. Kim Soo looked out the window at the Seoul skyline. All that light, all those lives stacked on top of each other, none of them knowing what moved beneath. 5, she said. The man smiled the way men smile when they own the outcome. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, quiet and indifferent, covering everything. The first explosion happened on a Monday morning at 6:47 a.m. Dan was in the shower when his phone began going off. Not the usual cascade of morning notifications, but the specific pattern he'd programmed for emergencies. 3 short vibrations, pause, 3 more. He was dressed and on the phone before the steam had cleared the mirror. Warehouse 7 in the Mapo district. Electrical fault, the initial report said. But Dan had been in this business long enough to know the difference between an accident and a message, and this had the grammar of a message. He kissed Nia on the forehead without waking her, and was gone before sunrise. By the time she came downstairs, the news was already running aerial footage. An orange glow against gray sky, fire crews moving in organized lines, a reporter gesturing at the smoke with practiced urgency. The cheer in red, industrial fire, Mapo district. Cause under investigation. Nia set her coffee down slowly. Warehouse 7 stored pharmaceutical cold chain equipment. High value, low profile. Not the kind of facility that made news unless someone wanted it to. She called Dan. Voicemail. She texted. Saw the news. I'm here if you need me. Then she opened her laptop, pulled up the property records for the facility, cross-referenced the insurance documentation she'd helped restructure 8 months ago, and started building a timeline. It was what she did. She found the architecture underneath events. By noon, Warehouse 7 was no longer the only story. A secondary fire had been reported at a cold storage facility in Yeongdongpo, smaller, contained quickly, but the accelerant pattern, according to a source Dan's security team had inside the fire investigation unit, was identical. Not similar. Identical. Same ignition point. Same burn signature. Someone had used a manual. Dan's operations director, a meticulous man named Cho who wore the same gray slacks every day and had never once raised his voice, was found dead in his apartment that afternoon. The official determination, suicide. Single gunshot. No note. Dan had known Cho for 11 years. He stood in the hallway outside the apartment building with his hands in his pockets and his jaw locked in the particular way that meant he was doing the same thing Nia did. Putting the grief somewhere temporary, somewhere it couldn't compromise the next hour. His head of security leaned close. Cho met with someone 2 days ago. Off calendar. We're pulling the footage. Pull everything, Dan said. That evening, the two of them sat on opposite ends of the kitchen island with files spread between them. Dan's security reports and Nia's timeline laid side by side, a conversation in documents. She had drawn a line connecting the warehouse locations, the timing intervals, the method variation. The line pointed inward, toward the center of Dan's infrastructure like a closing fist. She's not working alone, Nia said. No, this is organized. The warehouses are a pressure campaign. They're not trying to destroy the operation, they're trying to fracture your attention. Split your resources before the real move. Dan looked at her for a long moment. There were people on his payroll who didn't think that cleanly under pressure. The real move, he said. The wedding. She said it flatly. Not with fear. With the tone of a woman reclassifying a threat from column B to column C. He reached across the files and took her hand. She let him, though she didn't stop looking at the timeline. Outside, Seoul hummed its indifferent hum. Somewhere across the city, in a facility with blacked-out windows and a floor plan that didn't match any city record, 200 men were running drills in the dark. And in a room above them all, Kim Soo was looking at a photograph of Nia's wedding venue and doing the math on exactly how many points of entry a cathedral had. She'd already counted the exits. The cathedral was full of white flowers and people who didn't know they were in danger. Gardenias lined every pew. White orchids cascaded from iron fixtures bolted to stone pillars that had stood for 140 years. The light came through stained glass in long amber columns, falling across the guests in warm geometry, and for exactly 11 minutes after Nia appeared at the top of the aisle, everything was what it was supposed to be. She walked slowly. Not from nerves. Nia didn't do nerves, not visibly, but because Dan was watching her from the altar with an expression she had never seen on him before. Unguarded. Unarmored. The syndicate boss stripped down to just a man who couldn't believe his luck. She wanted to give him time to look. The dress was ivory silk, structured at the bodice, fluid from the waist down. No veil. She decided against it early. She didn't want anything between her face and the moment. She was 12 steps from the altar when the doors behind her blew open. Not wind. Not drama. Just a concussive force that turned the amber light into chaos and sent the flower arrangements off their pedestals in slow, terrible arcs. The sound came a half-second later. The particular flat crack of suppressed weapons, which was somehow worse than the alternative because it meant whoever had come in wasn't concerned about witnesses. Dan moved before anyone else did. He was off the altar in 2 strides, putting himself between Nia and the doors, and she felt his hand close around her wrist, firm, practiced, pulling her low and behind the nearest pillar. Around them the guests were fracturing in every direction, the cathedral filling with screaming that the stone walls threw back and amplified. Kim Soo walked in through the main doors like she owned the architecture. She was wearing black, which Nia registered with the cold clarity of someone whose mind organizes data under pressure. Behind her came 12 men, moving in the fan formation of people who have done this in buildings before. 3 of Dan's security detail were already down. The others were repositioning, communicating in the clipped shorthand of trained men, adjusting to a scenario that had just changed categories. Kim Soo's eyes found Nia immediately. They always did. She smiled, unhurried, proprietary, and said nothing because she didn't need to. The smile was the sentence. What happened next happened very fast. A man the size of a commercial refrigerator stepped out from Kim Soo's left flank. This was K Prime, and if the name had the quality of a code designation, it was because that's exactly what it was. 6'7", 300 pounds distributed without waste. His face had the expressionless quality of someone who had long ago separated the physical act of violence from any internal commentary about it. He walked toward Dan. Dan handed Nia off to his second, a compact, quiet man named Rio who materialized from the left transept like he'd been waiting, and turned to face K Prime with the particular stillness of a man who has done his own math and decided the odds are negotiable. What followed was not cinematic. Real fighting rarely is. It was brutal and close and loud in a way that had nothing to do with the weapons being fired across the rest of the cathedral. Dan was fast, technically precise, and absorbing punishment without letting it register on his face, but K Prime was simply built at a different scale, and every exchange had the quality of a man arguing with a wall. Nia watched from behind Rio's arm for exactly 4 seconds. Then K Prime landed something that put Dan on one knee, and Nia felt the spreadsheet close and something older open. She never got to act on it. A cloth. A pressure at the back of her head. The particular chemical smell she recognized from a toxicology briefing she'd attended 2 years ago in a basement conference room where a man with no eyebrows had explained exactly what compounds smell like before they take you under. She had time to think, column C. She had time to think, Dan. Then the cathedral ceiling dissolved into nothing, and Nia was gone before she hit the floor. Behind her, Dan looked up from one knee, and the expression that crossed his face was not grief and not rage, but something that lived below both. A cold, structural collapse, like a building's foundation cracking, silent and total, before the walls come down. K Prime hit him again. Outside, 2 black vans were already moving. She came back to consciousness in increments, the way you surface from a dream that doesn't want to release you. First, cold. A specific, deliberate cold, the kind that isn't ambient but administered. The temperature set with intention, kept just uncomfortable enough to prevent rest. Her body registered it before her mind did, a slow inventory moving from her bare feet upward. Concrete floor. Wrists bound behind her, zip-tied with the professional snugness of someone who'd done it many times. The silk dress still on, ruined at the hem. One heel missing. She kept her eyes closed for 90 seconds. This was not panic. This was protocol. 90 seconds to assemble what she knew before she gave anyone in the room the information that she was awake. What she knew, she was alive, which meant she was leverage, not a casualty. She was in a large space. She could tell from the way sound moved, the distant metallic echo of a warehouse. There was ambient light behind her eyelids, artificial and flat. She could hear at least 3 distinct sets of breathing, 2 of which were positioned near a door to her left. She opened her eyes. The warehouse ceiling was 30 feet above her, industrial steel crossbeams holding up corrugated panels. Bare bulbs hung on long cables, swaying almost imperceptibly. Her chair was bolted to the floor. She tested the zip ties without moving her shoulders, a millimeter of flex, high grade, recently applied. Kim Soo was sitting across from her on a folding chair turned backward, arms draped over the backrest, watching her the way a person watches a film they've already seen. Patient. Already knowing how it ends. There she is, Kim-soo said. Nia said nothing. I've been looking forward to this conversation for 2 years. I had a lot of time to write it. Kim-soo tilted her head. You could at least tell me I look good. Nia looked at her steadily. What do you want? Everything Dan gave you. Starting with the understanding that it was always mine. The first 12 hours were psychological. No food. Timed water. Enough to sustain, calibrated to remind. Music played from a wireless speaker in the corner. Something deliberately banal, the audio equivalent of fluorescent light. Kim-soo's men rotated in pairs, standing at the edges of Nia's vision, never speaking. Kim-soo herself came and went, conducting business in the far end of the warehouse with the brisk efficiency of someone running an organization, not a vendetta. Which was the point Nia understood. The message was, you are not the priority. You are an errand. She used the time. She cataloged the guards' rotation patterns. 22-minute intervals, the left door pair switching out before the right, which meant a brief window of single coverage near the east wall. She identified the camera positions. 3 visible, 1 probable blind spot at the northeast structural column. She noted that the warehouse had a vehicle bay to the south, its shutter not fully closed, letting in a thin blade of outside light that shifted angle between hours 1 and 6, which meant she was facing southeast, which meant the city was north. She did not think about Dan. She filed Dan under later, in the column for things too large to process in sequence. The second 12 hours were physical. Not violence, not yet. Kim-soo was too deliberate for randomness. This was deprivation architecture. The temperature dropped 4 degrees. The chair position was shifted once, slightly, to prevent Nia from achieving any bodily equilibrium. The music changed to silence, which was worse. By hour 36, Nia's body had begun filing its own complaints. Her shoulders burned from the sustained angle of the restraints. Her feet were numb. The hunger had moved through its loud phase and into something quieter and more corrosive. Sleep had come in shallow, involuntary minutes before the cold reclaimed her. She breathed through it. There is a thing that happens to the mind when the body has been stripped of its resources. A narrowing, a concentration, like water finding the lowest path. Fear either consumes you or it clarifies you. Nia had learned early which one she was. She thought about the tracker. Sewn into the seam of the dress 6 weeks ago, on a Thursday afternoon, by a tailor who had done work for Dan's security infrastructure before and who asked no questions. A passive unit, military grade, the size of a flat coat button. Kim-soo's team had scanned her for active signals on arrival. She'd felt the wand, registered the pause when it passed the dress seam, then the continued movement when it returned nothing. Passive units only ping when queried by a paired receiver. The receiver was with Mia. By hour 40, Kim-soo pulled a chair close and leaned forward with her elbows on her knees and studied Nia the way you study a problem you respect. You haven't asked about Dan, she said. Something close to admiration in it. Have you asked about your own people? Nia said. The ones from the cathedral. Kim-soo's expression flickered. The first uncontrolled thing Nia had seen from her. A half-second recalibration. Nia filed it. Column A. She doesn't know what Dan did after I was taken. Get some rest, Kim-soo said, standing. Tomorrow I need you functional. She left. The lights dropped by half. Nia sat in the dimness and breathed slowly and thought about her sisters. One of whom, by her estimation, was already moving. She allowed herself exactly 1 moment of something warm. Then she closed it off and went back to counting guard rotations. There were still 8 hours until morning. She would use all of them. Kim-soo arrived at hour 46 carrying a Bluetooth speaker and a pair of flat shoes. She set the shoes in front of Nia's chair with the deliberate placement of someone presenting a gift, then straightened and looked at her with that same patient, proprietary expression. The one that had been marinating for 2 years in a 6x8 cell. I've been thinking about this since the conference room, Kim-soo said. You remember the conference room? Nia said nothing. You danced like it meant something. Like you were proving a point. She tilted her head. I want to see it again. Without the adrenaline. Without the audience cheering for you. She paused. Without the working foot. The 2 guards behind her moved before Nia could recalibrate. What happened was quick and clinical and designed to be irreversible within the moment. 1 guard pinned her leg at the shin. The second produced a tool that belonged in a different context entirely. Kim-soo watched without looking away, which was somehow the worst part. The steadiness of it, the absence of heat in her eyes. This wasn't rage. This was accounting. Nia made one sound. One. Then she locked her jaw and breathed through her nose and went somewhere internal that pain couldn't fully follow. The zip tie on her wrists was cut. Her arms fell forward, dead weight from the hours of restraint, and the blood returning to her hands felt like being stabbed in reverse. Kim Soo crouched to her eye level. "Dance," she said. The speaker began playing the same song from the conference room. Same track. Same tempo. Kim Soo had kept it. Of course she had. Nia looked at the flat shoes on the floor. She looked at her foot. She looked at Kim Soo. And then, slowly, using the chair's edge, she stood. It took 4 attempts. The first 3 her vision whited out and she had to grip the chair back and breathe the pain back down, resetting her threshold each time like adjusting a dial. The guards watched. Kim Soo watched. No one moved to help or hinder because this was the performance, the humiliation engine, designed to run on Nia's own attempts. She stood on the 4th try. Fully. Without holding the chair. Kim Soo smiled. Nia began to move. It was not the movement from the conference room. That had been fluid, instinctive, the movement of a woman in full command of her body. This was something else, halting, asymmetric, a series of controlled collapses caught at the last second and converted into the next position. It should have looked like defeat. It looked, instead, like someone refusing to give the room what it came for. Kim Soo's smile thinned. By the 3rd measure of the song, something was happening on Nia's face that Kim Soo couldn't immediately classify. Not tears, she'd expected tears, had been waiting for them. Not defiance, which she'd also prepared for. This was something quieter and stranger. Nia was beginning to laugh. Not hysteria. Not the fracture point laughter of someone coming apart. Low, private. The laugh of someone who has just received information they'd been waiting for without knowing they were waiting. Her eyes went somewhere else. Not vacant but focused. Focused on something Kim Soo couldn't see, somewhere past the warehouse walls. Kim Soo crossed the floor in 4 steps. "What is funny?" Nia looked at her, still laughing, still quiet about it, and said, "I was just thinking about my sister." "You don't have a sister." "I have 2. Nia's voice was hoarse from the hours but steady underneath it. "Triplets." "Did your research not cover that?" Kim Soo went still. "The middle one, Mia. The army had to let her go." Nia shifted her weight, redistributing the pain with the practiced adjustment of someone who had been doing it for hours. Not because she did anything wrong. Because there's no ethical framework for what she does to people who hurt the ones she loves. She paused. "She's been looking for a reason." "You're lying. The tracker in my dress is passive signal. Your scanner wouldn't have found it." Nia smiled now, fully, and it was the most frightening thing in the room. "She's already been pinged. She's already moving." She looked at Kim Soo with something that was almost pity. "You brought 200 men, and it will not be enough." Kim Soo hit her. Clean, hard, the strike of someone who trained for it. Nia's head snapped sideways. She straightened slowly. The smile was still there, adjusted but intact, like a flag after weather. Kim Soo turned to the nearest guard. "Get the flash drive. And call in the outer perimeter. All of it." She was already walking toward the far end of the warehouse, already recalculating, and her composure was holding but only just a structure under new load, checking its own joints. Behind her, Nia lowered herself back to the chair and let the pain have the minutes it needed. She breathed deliberately, counted guard positions, noted that Kim Soo's stride pattern had changed. Shorter steps, higher tension in the shoulders. She filed it. Column B, she's afraid. Then she closed her eyes and thought about Mia, who was already in the city, and Sia, who was never far behind, and felt something in her chest settle like a key finding its lock. 8 hours. Maybe less. She just had to stay intact until then. The story is far from over. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell so you're first in line when the next chapter hits. No spoilers for those who sleep on it, and no replays for those who weren't watching. This inner circle moves fast. Get in now or spend tomorrow catching up. There is a story their mother used to tell about the night Mia was born. Nia had heard it so many times it had ceased to feel like narrative and become instead a fixed property of the world, like weather or gravity. The 3 of them had arrived in the wrong order. Sia first, easy and certain, then Nia 11 minutes later, then Mia at the 2-hour mark, after the doctors had stopped being calm about it. She came out silent, which newborns are not supposed to be. and the silence lasted long enough that the room reconfigured itself around fear. Then Mia opened her eyes. Their mother always paused here when she told it. She looked at the doctor, she would say, like she was memorizing his face for later. The nurses laughed. Their mother never did, quite. Nia thought about this now, sitting in the half-dark of a warehouse with her wrists free and her body running on vapors, and found that it still made her smile. Not because it was funny, because it was accurate. Mia at 4 hours old and Mia at 31 years old were the same creature. Cataloging, assessing, filing everything under the single operating question that had organized her entire existence. Is this person a threat to mine? The army had recruited her at 19 because she had a gift for reading terrain that their psychologists couldn't fully explain. Not just physical terrain, but human terrain, the topology of intent. She could walk into a room and map the violence in it before anything had happened. They gave her teams. They gave her theaters. They gave her a file designation that Nia had only seen once, in a document she wasn't supposed to have access to, and which described her sister in language that made the clinical detachment of bureaucratic writing feel genuinely inadequate. 4,476 confirmed. The number wasn't the frightening part. The frightening part was the confirmed. The accounting. The fact that someone somewhere had looked at a human being and reduced her life's work to a spreadsheet column, and that Mia's response upon learning the number had been, according to the same document, to say, "That's not all of them." The army had opened the door and suggested she leave before she became a question they'd have to answer publicly. Mia had walked out with her kit bag, her silence, and the particular quality of stillness that settles over a weapon when it's at rest between uses. She'd been living in Busan for 3 years. Off-grid largely. Running what appeared to be a small private security consultation that was, in practice, a one-woman enterprise that took on problems other firms wouldn't classify as solvable. She answered to 3 people on Earth: Sia, Nia, and their mother, in that order and with decreasing frequency as the list went on. When the passive tracker in Nia's dress had pinged Mia's receiver at hour 43, a single clean pulse, the prearranged signal that meant I am in the field and I cannot move, come find me. Mia had already been in Seoul for 6 hours. She'd driven up from Busan in the night without being asked, with the particular animal instinct of someone whose threat-reading equipment had been running Nia's, wetting on a slow background process for weeks. She'd felt the wrongness before she'd had the data to confirm it. Sia had arrived at Mia's hotel room 2 hours after the ping, carrying a tactical bag and an expression that on any other face would have read as calm, but on Sia read as the outer surface of something that had no interest in being calm. Sia was the one people underestimated. Where Mia was still and arresting, the kind of presence that recalibrated a room on entry. Sia was fluent in invisibility. She moved through environments like she belonged in all of them and none of them, which was its own kind of extraordinary. She'd spent 6 years in private intelligence before deciding that institutional constraints were a form of friction she didn't need. Together they were what their mother had always privately known she'd built. Not daughters exactly, though they were that too, but a system. Interlocking, redundant, each compensating for the other's exposure. In the warehouse, Nia looked at the northeast column with its probable camera blind spot and thought, Mia will enter from the vehicle bay. Sia will already be inside when she does. This was not hope. This was knowledge. She'd said what she said to Kim Soo not to taunt her, but to begin the psychological dismantling. To introduce a variable into Kim Soo's calculations that couldn't be countered because it couldn't be fully believed until it was too late to act on. The 200 men were already called in. Their positions were now fixed. Fixed positions were Mia's preferred condition. Neuroscience has a name for what the brain does when it believes a threat has been neutralized. A measurable reduction in vigilance activity in the prefrontal cortex, a reallocation of resources away from threat monitoring toward consolidation. Kim Soo's team believed the perimeter was sealed. They believed the scanner had cleared Nia completely. They believed they controlled all the variables. The belief itself was the vulnerability. Nia heard the outer door at the vehicle bay move. Not open move. A millimeter of pressure differential. Detectable only because she'd been listening to the ambient sounds of this warehouse for 48 hours and had memorized all of them. She straightened in the chair. Reset her breathing. Let her face go neutral and tired, which wasn't difficult, which required no performance at all. Kim Soo was coming back across the warehouse floor, flash drive in hand, 2 guards flanking her, the expression of someone who has decided to close a negotiation. Nia folded her hands in her lap. Somewhere in the dark above the northeast column, a shadow moved and was still again. The boogie woman was in the building. They arrived in 3 waves, which was professional, and which told Dan everything he needed to know about who had trained them. He was watching from the roof of a cold storage facility 400 meters northeast of the warehouse. Flat on his stomach, elbows in gravel, a pair of thermal binoculars pressed to his face. Beside him, Rio was running a quiet communication channel through a bone conduction earpiece, relaying position updates in intervals of 90 seconds. Neither of them had slept. Neither of them mentioned it. The first wave had come in at 0200, 8 vehicles, staggered entry, parking at 4 separate points around the warehouse perimeter with the geometric precision of a net being drawn. The second wave at 0315. The third and largest, just before 0400. A convoy of panel vans that disgorged men in dark tactical clothing who moved into position with the unhurried efficiency of people who believed the outcome was already decided. 200, give or take. Dan had stopped counting at 180 and started thinking about geometry instead. He'd spent the hours after the cathedral doing what he always did when the variables exceeded his direct control. He'd made a list of what he knew, identified the single most important unknown, and moved toward it. The most important unknown was Nia's location. He'd had that within 6 hours, which was faster than Kim Su's team had apparently accounted for, because the passive tracker pinged Mia's receiver, and Mia, who Dan had met exactly once and found genuinely alarming, had contacted Rio through a channel that shouldn't have existed, with coordinates that were current to within a 12-meter radius. He'd wanted to move immediately. Mia had said no. She'd said it with the particular flatness of someone who doesn't explain themselves because explanation implies the possibility of debate, and there was no debate. Not yet, she'd said. Nia is functional. The longer we wait, the more of them arrive, and I want them all in one place. Dan had understood structurally. He hadn't liked it. He'd spent 31 hours understanding it and not liking it simultaneously, which was its own kind of discipline. Now, watching the last of the outer perimeter positions fill, he thought, she was right. All of them in one place. All of them with their attention oriented inward, toward the warehouse, toward Nia, toward the flash drive that Kim Su believed was her exit strategy. None of them looking up. In his earpiece, Rio said, "Northern snipers confirm positions." Dan keyed twice. Acknowledged. The snipers were not his people. They were Mia's, which meant they'd materialized from somewhere he couldn't fully account for, and were apparently content to remain unintroduced. He'd asked Rio how many. Rio had said enough, which was either a real answer or a deflection, and Dan had decided it didn't matter. At 0423, the first perimeter guard stepped away from his post to light a cigarette. He was 3 meters from his position when the cigarette became irrelevant. No sound. No drama. He simply stopped being a problem, and the man 10 meters to his left had exactly 4 seconds to process the change in his peripheral vision before he also stopped being a problem, and then it moved down the line with the quiet momentum of a sentence reaching its period. Not fast, not slow, at exactly the pace required. The outer perimeter went silent in 4 minutes and 11 seconds. Dan was already moving. Inside the warehouse, Kim Su heard nothing, because there was nothing to hear. This was the design. The outer ring had been selected and positioned to absorb exactly this kind of approach, a sacrificial buffer that bought time for the interior to respond. Except the interior didn't know the buffer was gone, because the communication architecture between the perimeter and the interior teams ran on a check-in system rather than continuous contact, and the next check-in wasn't for 17 minutes. 17 minutes was longer than this required. Dan came in through the vehicle bay with 4 of his own men, moving low and fast along the western wall, using the structural columns for cover. The interior guards, 30, maybe 35, distributed across the warehouse floor with the remainder clustered near Kim Su's position at the center, were oriented toward Nia, which meant their backs were to the walls. Dan found the first clean angle and waited. In his earpiece, Rio, from a position near the east entrance. Sia says go. The next 90 seconds were not something Dan would describe afterward in any detail, because the details were the kind that accumulated weight the longer you carried them. What he would say later was that the interior team was well trained and that it didn't matter, because there is a threshold of coordinated pressure beyond which training becomes largely biographical. The warehouse lights cut at the 40-second mark. Sia, from somewhere in the infrastructure above, who had apparently been inside the building for 3 hours and whose presence had not been detected by anyone, which was either a testament to her skill or an indictment of Kim Soo's security, and was in fact both. Darkness. Thermal. The guards with their attention caught between threats they couldn't fully locate. It was over in the way that things are over when one side has prepared and the other has only positioned. When the emergency lighting stuttered back on, dim orange, the color of aftermath, the warehouse floor held a silence that had recently been something else. Dan crossed it without hurrying, stepping around what needed to be stepped around, his eyes already finding Nia in the chair at the center. She was upright, hands in her lap, eyes open and tracking, taking in the changed room with the calm, systematic attention of someone running an updated inventory. She looked at him for a long moment. "You took 31 hours, she said. "Mia wouldn't let me move earlier." She was right. "I know." He crouched in front of her and took her face in both hands and looked at her the way he'd looked at her at the altar, before everything, that unguarded, unarmored look. Except now it had weight behind it, the weight of 31 hours of controlled terror converted into the specific relief of a man who had done the math on loss and found it unsurvivable. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. Some things were too structural for words. Then he looked at her foot, and his jaw locked, and the unarmored thing closed, and something else entirely took its place. Kim Soo was still in the building. They came through the skylight. Not the vehicle bay, not the east entrance, not any of the ground-level points that Kim Soo's remaining interior guards had repositioned to cover when the lights cut. The skylight, a reinforced industrial panel 30 feet above the warehouse floor, in the section of roof directly above Kim Soo's position. Which meant they'd been on the roof, which meant they'd crossed it in darkness and silence while everything below was reorganizing around the chaos Dan's team had introduced, and no one had seen them because no one had thought to look up. The panel came away cleanly. 2 ropes, military grade, deployed in the same second. Mia landed first. There is a specific quality of physical presence that defies dimensional accounting, where the space a person occupies doesn't correspond to their actual measurements, where a room recalibrates on their entry in a way that has nothing to do with size. Mia was not large. 5'8", lean, with the kind of efficient musculature that doesn't announce itself until it's in motion. What she had instead was stillness of a particular density. The stillness of something that has resolved all its internal conflicts and reached a state of pure operational clarity. She landed in a controlled drop, absorbed the impact through her knees without sound, and was upright in the same motion, and the 2 guards nearest to her had exactly enough time to turn before that window closed. Sia landed 4 seconds later, which was deliberate spacing. Enough time for Mia to have already restructured the immediate geometry of the room so that Sia arrived into cleared space rather than contested space. Sia moved differently than Mia. Where Mia was a fixed point around which violence organized itself, Sia was fluid, directional, covering angles rather than occupying them. They were the same person expressed through different operational philosophies, and together they were a system that had been field-tested across 3 continents and had not yet encountered a configuration it couldn't close. Kim Soo took 3 steps backward. She was not a woman who stepped backward. The gesture was involuntary, postural, the body registering something before the mind could edit the response. She looked at Mia with the expression of someone whose research had contained the number, but not the reality of the number. And finding the gap between those 2 things was now her primary problem. "Nia," Mia said, without looking at her. Her eyes hadn't left Kim Soo. "I'm functional," Nia said from the chair. "Foot." Addressed later. A pause that contained an entire conversation. Then Mia said, "Sia." Sia was already moving toward Nia. Not running, the unhurried precision of someone who has mapped the room and identified the shortest uncontested path. She produced a blade from somewhere on her person, crouched behind Nia's chair, and the zip ties came away. Then she was in front of her, hands on Nia's face, the same gesture Dan had made but faster and more diagnostic, running a rapid physical assessment with the practiced efficiency of someone with field medical training. "Pupils equal," Sia said quietly. "I know," Nia said. "You look terrible. I've been awake for 48 hours. You look specifically terrible. There's a distinction." But Sia's hands were already moving, producing a compression wrap from the tactical bag, working on Nia's foot with a focus and precision that converted the clinical into the intimate. Across the warehouse, Kim Soo had recovered enough to recalculate. She still had 9 interior guards. The the ones who'd repositioned to cover the ground entries, now turning back toward the center. She had the flash drive in her jacket pocket. She had the particular resource of a person who has decided that the scenario has moved into exit strategy territory and is willing to spend whatever is necessary to reach the door. "Take them," she said. The 9 guards moved. Mia turned to face them with the expression of someone who has been presented with a task that falls within her established competency range and finds no reason to adjust her effect accordingly. She looked, in this moment, like their mother at the kitchen table solving a crossword, present, focused, faintly interested. What followed was not a fight in the conventional narrative sense, because a fight implies meaningful contest between parties whose outcomes are genuinely uncertain. This was more like a proof, a demonstration, conducted at speed, of a series of principles that Mia had spent 12 years refining in theaters where the margin for error was calibrated in lives. She moved through the 9 guards the way water moves through a space. Not forcefully, but inevitably, finding the path of least structural resistance, and then being the reason that path closed behind her. The first 2 went down before they'd closed half the distance. The third caught an angle and thought he had her, and the thought lasted approximately as long as it took Mia to demonstrate why it was wrong. The remaining 6 reconfigured, which was tactically sound and practically insufficient. Dan's 4 men held the perimeter, covering exits, but they weren't needed at the center. Nobody was needed at the center. In 4 minutes and some seconds, Kim Soo's last line of interior defense was no longer a line and no longer defending anything. Mia rolled her left shoulder once, a small, businesslike rotation, and turned to face Kim Soo, who was standing alone now in the orange emergency light with her hand in her jacket pocket and her composure performing extraordinary structural work. Nia, wrapped foot, Sia's arm across her back for balance, stood and looked at Kim Soo across the warehouse floor. Kim Soo looked back. The flash drive was still in her pocket. She knew it. They all knew it. And in the particular silence that follows the sudden removal of a great deal of ambient noise, Kim Soo made the calculation that people in her position make when the variables have all resolved against them. The calculation between what I have left and what it's worth. "The drive," she said. Her voice was controlled. The control was costing her. "It contains everything. The claw's full operational structure. Names, accounts, supply chains. Things that would end careers. End lives." She looked at Dan. "I'll give it to you. I just want to walk out." Dan said nothing. Mia said nothing. Nia looked at Kim Soo with the calm of someone who has spent 48 hours converting suffering into clarity, and said, "Sit down, Kim Soo." The authority in it was not performed. It was structural. The voice of a woman who had survived 2 days of deliberate dismantling and arrived at the other side not diminished but distilled. Kim Soo slowly sat. The chair Kim Soo sat in was not bolted to the floor. Nia noticed this immediately, the small, unintentional irony of it, that Kim Soo had spent 2 days engineering Nia's immobility and now occupied an identical chair with nothing holding her down except the weight of what had just happened to her operational infrastructure. She sat straight, which was discipline, and her hands were folded in her lap, which was performance, and only her eyes moved, tracking Mia, tracking Dan, tracking the exits with the compulsive inventory of someone who hadn't yet fully accepted that the inventory was academic. Mia pulled a chair from the wall and sat across from her, reversed, arms draped over the backrest. The posture was almost identical to the one Kim Soo had used across from Nia for 2 days, and whether the mirroring was intentional or simply the way Mia sat, the effect was the same. A message delivered without language. Dan stood at the periphery. This was Mia's room now, and everyone understood it, including Dan, which said something about Mia. "The drive first," Mia said. Kim Soo looked at her. "I want terms." "You want terms?" Mia considered this with the same expression she'd had facing 9 armed guards, faint, impersonal interest. "Here are the terms. You give me the drive, and I don't finish what I started with your 9 friends." She paused. "Those are the terms." A silence. Kim Soo reached into her jacket pocket and placed the flash drive on the floor between them. She slid it forward with 2 fingers, a gesture that had the quality of reluctant tribute. Sia crossed from Nia's side, picked it up without crouching, a fluid dip and rise, and handed it to Dan without looking at him, already moving back. Dan turned it over once in his fingers, examined it, pocketed it. "Now," Mia said, "tell us about the claw." Kim Soo looked at the floor for a moment. When she looked up, something in her face had shifted, not broken, not soft, but reconfigured, the expression of a person who has completed their internal accounting and arrived at a number they can live with. The claw isn't an organization, she said. It's a succession mechanism. When a regional power structure reaches a certain scale, the claw activates, moves in underneath it, hollows it out, replaces the leadership from within. It's been running for 20 years across 6 provinces. She paused. Your operation was the target. Not because of what it is now. Because of what the projection models say it becomes in 5 years. Dan's expression didn't change. Who runs it? A principal. I never met him. Nobody at my level meets him. He communicates through intermediaries, through dead drops, through. Who runs it? Dan said again. Kim Soo looked at him with something that might, in a different configuration of events, have been pity. I was told his name once. As a credential. As proof that the offer I was being given was real, and that the backing behind it was real. She stopped. Say it, Nia said from across the room. Kim Soo opened her mouth. The sound was not loud. It was contained, percussive, sourced from somewhere inside Kim Soo's skull. And it was over before the room had time to fully register that it had begun. Kim Soo's body completed the sentence her mouth had started. A forward slump, the folded hands separating, the composed posture releasing all at once into the loose grammar of a body whose instructions had stopped mid-transmission. The chair tipped. She hit the floor. The room held its breath for a full 3 seconds. Mia was already on her feet, moving to the perimeter walls, scanning for a shooter's angle. But there was no angle, no entry point, no broken window, no evidence of an external source. The skylight panels they'd come through were intact. The vehicle bay shutter was still at its position. The walls were solid. Whatever had killed Kim Soo had not come from outside the warehouse. Sia crouched over the body with the rapid efficiency of field triage, then looked up at Mia with an expression that transmitted a specific clinical finding without words. Mia looked at Dan. Dan was standing very still. His face had done the thing Nia had seen once before. At the cathedral, when K-Prime had put him on one knee, that silent structural collapse below the surface. Except this time it was different. This time the collapse wasn't grief or rage. It was recognition. Dan, Nia said. He didn't answer immediately. He was looking at Kim Soo's body with the specific focus of someone reading a text they already know by heart, finding the familiar words in an unfamiliar place. Rio stepped close and said something quiet near his ear. Dan nodded once, very slowly. The nod of a man confirming to himself something he'd been not knowing for a long time with great deliberate effort. I know this, he said. Not to Rio. Not to the room. To himself. I've seen this before. Nia crossed the floor to him, careful, Sia's wrap doing its work, her body running on the last of something, and stood in front of him and waited until his eyes came back from wherever they'd gone. Tell me, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. The unarmored thing again. But this time what was underneath the armor was not relief and not love, but the specific exposed quality of a person who has just watched their private architecture of denial detonate from the inside. My father, he said, had a name for how he handled people who talked too much. The warehouse was very quiet. He called it the signature, Dan said. He was proud of it. He told me once, I was 16, that a man's methods were his identity, that you could always tell who'd been in a room by what they left behind. He paused. I haven't spoken to my father in 4 years. I believed he was gone. Out of the structure. Retired or dead or both. He looked at Kim Soo on the floor. He's neither, he said. Mia stood at the edge of the room and said nothing, which for Mia was its own kind of statement. Sia had straightened and was looking at Dan with the careful attention of someone updating a threat assessment in real time. Nia took Dan's hand. He held it with the grip of a man using an anchor. Outside, Seoul was beginning its pre-dawn reconfiguration. The city's lowest traffic hour, the brief window between the last of the night and the first of the morning where the streets held a quiet that felt borrowed. Inside the warehouse, the emergency lighting continued its orange work, indifferent to the specific gravity of what had just been understood. Dan's father was alive. Dan's father ran the claw. Dan's father had been watching his son's operation grow for years, running projections, activating mechanisms. And when the moment came, he had sent not a stranger but Kim Soo, a woman whose personal vendetta provided perfect cover for the structural operation underneath it. The efficiency of it was almost paternal. They left the warehouse at first light. Nia walked with Sia's shoulder under her arm and didn't speak for the first 10 minutes, and no one asked her to. The city was gray and cool and indifferent, the streets beginning their first tentative movements. A delivery truck, a woman walking a dog, the distant percussion of a city remembering what it was. Ordinary things, occurring in their ordinary sequence, wholly unaware that 4 people had just walked out of a building carrying knowledge that would restructure everything. Dan walked ahead, slightly apart. Nia watched him from behind Sia's arm and understood something she hadn't had language for until now. That there is a particular species of wound that doesn't announce itself as a wound, that presents instead as a structural adjustment, a quiet load-bearing shift, and that the reason it's so dangerous is that the person carrying it often doesn't know they're bleeding until they stop moving. Dan had been moving since the cathedral. He hadn't stopped once. She let him have the distance. Mia walked on the other side of Dan, not close, not conversational, the proximity of someone keeping a perimeter. She hadn't spoken since the warehouse. Her silence had a different quality than the silences of people processing. It was active, oriented outward. The silence of someone whose threat monitoring hadn't downgraded because the immediate operation had resolved. For Mia, the resolution of one threat was simply the opening chapter of the next threat's biography. She was already thinking about Dan's father. Nia knew this because she was thinking about Dan's father too, and she and Mia, for all their differences of method and expression, had always thought in the same direction. They reached the vehicles at the end of the access road. 2 of Dan's, Mia's rental, which was not technically a rental, and stopped. Dan turned to face them. The gray morning light was not kind to his face, but it was accurate. It showed what was there without editorializing, and what was there was a man who had slept 4 hours in 2 days and learned in the last 40 minutes that his father had orchestrated the abduction and torture of the person he loved most, and that the grief and rage of this were currently being held in compression by the same discipline that had kept him functional since the cathedral, and that the compression was holding. But only just. He looked at Nia. "I need to tell you something," he said. "I should have told you before the wedding. Before the threat started. Maybe before all of it." She waited. "My father didn't retire. He didn't disappear. I built distance from him deliberately, structured the operation so that our interests wouldn't intersect, because I told myself I believed, that geographic and operational distance was the same as safety." He paused. "I knew what he was capable of. I knew his methods. I knew the signature." He looked at her steadily, the unarmored thing present and not apologizing for itself. "I chose not to know what that meant for the people near me." Nia was quiet for a moment. "You built something good," she said. "From a foundation that wasn't. That doesn't. I'm not finished." She stepped closer, Sia's support releasing as she found her own balance, redistributing her weight with the careful architecture of someone relearning what she can hold. "You built something good. You chose it, repeatedly, against the grain of what you came from. That's not nothing. That's not small." She looked at him. "But we're done with the distance. From here, I'm in all of it. Every room. Every decision." She paused. "The foundation gets rebuilt or everything above it is borrowed time." Dan looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said. It was not an agreement to a proposition. It was the sound of something being laid down. He pulled her close, careful of her foot, and held her with the particular grip of someone who has spent 31 hours calculating loss and is still not entirely convinced they've escaped it. She let him. She pressed her face into his neck and breathed once, deeply, and let 48 hours of compressed endurance begin its slow, necessary unraveling. Mia watched this exchange with the expression of someone who approves of an outcome without finding it sentimental. Sia put her head on Mia's shoulder. Mia allowed it for approximately 4 seconds, then stepped away. Sia smiled. It was a family. In the car, driving back through Seoul's early morning, Dan's phone began working through its backlog. Messages from his operations team, his security director, Rio legal counsel. The operational aftermath of a night that had involved 200 men and a warehouse and a quantity of resolution that would take weeks to fully process and document and make disappear in the way that these things were made to disappear. He answered each one in sequence, efficiently, his voice neutral and professional. On the 3rd call, he stopped talking mid-sentence. The call was from a number Nia didn't recognize. She could see the screen from the passenger seat, a local Seoul number with no contact name attached. Dan held the phone without speaking for a moment, and something changed in the quality of his silence, a new register, one she hadn't heard before. He ended the call without responding. The city moved past the windows. "Dan," she said. He was quiet for another moment. Outside, Sol was fully waking now. The streets filling, the light strengthening, the ordinary world conducting its ordinary business with serene unawareness. He called to congratulate me, Dan said. On the wedding. The word landed in the car like something placed there deliberately, with care, by a person who understood exactly the weight of it and had chosen it accordingly. Nia turned this over. The call. The timing. The word congratulate, with all its implications. I was watching, I am watching, I know what you have and I have always known, and the knowing is the message, and the message is that the distance you built was a fiction I permitted. He knows about me, she said. He's always known about you. Dan's jaw was locked. Kim Soo wasn't the plan. Kim Soo was the proof of concept. The city hummed. Morning light fell across the Han River, turning the water bronze and indifferent. In the back seat, Mia's eyes were open and her expression had resolved into something final and quiet. The expression of a person who has just received a mission brief and found it within her operational range. Sia reached across and took Nia's hand from the front seat, a gesture so ordinary in its intimacy. The simple warm press of a sister's palm. That it arrived like a door opening onto everything that the last 48 hours had tried to close. Nia held on. Seoul moved past them in its full morning brightness, indifferent and magnificent. A city that had seen generations of men who believed their power was permanent, who had built structures on that belief and watched them turn. Somewhere in it, in a room that didn't appear on any building directory, in a chair behind a desk in an office with a view of a river that had no interest in anyone's mythology, an old man was setting down a phone. He was smiling. He had waited for years. He could wait a little longer, or maybe not. If you've been gripped by this saga of revenge and betrayal, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't miss your chance to join the inner circle for every new release as the legend continues. What was your favorite moment from this movie, and why did it stand out as the best? Drop your thoughts below. I'll be in the comments section watching and replying to all your messages.